Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about international relations for History GCSE. So now I'm looking at what happened to the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey if you prefer, after the Paris peace treaties. So the Treaty of Sèvres was signed between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire in 1920. Sèvres, which up until that time was known for its porcelain. The great majority of Turkish people detested the Treaty of Sèvres. The Ottoman Empire lost the great majority of its territory. Prior to the First World War, immediately prior to it, the Ottoman Empire included the countries that we now call Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Israel, both coasts of Saudi Arabia as well, a little bit of Yemen. It had been much larger in the distant past. So the Ottoman Empire was reduced to its core, which was Turkey. So non-Turkish areas of the empire were lost, with the exception of Kurdistan. The Kurds are a distinctive ethnic group with their own Kurdish language. They're Sunni Muslims in almost all cases, just like the Turks, but they're a different ethnicity. Anyway, so the Turks were supposed to be given their own independent country at the end of the First World War. It didn't happen. There are over 25 million of them, the largest ethnic group in the world without a country to call its own. Anyway, under Sèvres, Turkey was to lose a lot of Turkey proper, a lot of Turkish majority areas. Some of it was to be ceded to Italy, other portions to France. The United Kingdom was to control the Dardanelles. That's the straits that connect the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. That had proved a very tough nut to crack in the First World War. The United Kingdom had not managed to do so, despite the support of India, Australia, New Zealand, France. That was the Battle of Gallipoli. The British were very eager to prevent Bolshevik Russia gaining access to the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles. It had been a dream of Russians for centuries to acquire a warm water port to break through to the Mediterranean. And as the Ottoman Empire was being neutered, then the British were going to step up to the plate and keep Russia in check, which again had been a British goal for over a century. The new Turkish state and Bolshevik Russia had an alarmingly close relationship in Western eyes. Up until this time, Russia and Turkey had often been at loggerheads, gone to war against each other 6 times in 200 years. Russia would no longer necessarily see Turkey as an enemy. They'd fought tooth and nail for a very long time. Anyway, hardline Turkish nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, overthrew their sultan. That's their monarch. The sultan was abominated by many for signing Sèvres. The new ruler of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, he adopted the surname Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks. Prior to that time, most Turks did not have a surname. They would be known as their personal name, then son of, and son of whoever and whoever, as in the father's name and mother's name. So Sultan Mehmed VI was downgraded to caliph, as in solely religious leader with no political role, in 1922. 2 years later, the caliphate was abolished. The Turkish Republic was declared, and Turkey no longer recognized any religious leader. It became a secular state. That's to say, a non-religious state. Yes, the majority of Turks are Muslims, but religion has no influence on the law of the land. You can be a Muslim, you can be a Hindu, you can be an atheist, you can be whatever. The government will not support or oppose any faith in Turkey. The Sultan Mehmed VI went into exile in the United Kingdom, incidentally. Turkey's hereditary enemy was Greece. Much of what we now call Turkey had been Greek for millennia. In ancient Greece, onto Byzantine Greece, up until the 15th century. So Greece was also given land at Turkey's expense. The Greeks called this the Megale Idea, like the Great Plan. Many Frenchmen and Britishers were decidedly Philhellene. That's to say, they liked the Greeks. They were filled with the utmost admiration for the culture of ancient Greece, and the ancient Greek language had been a pillar of education in Western Europe for a long time. They look back to antiquity, when Greece was the most civilized nation of all. The British Prime Minister from 1960 to 22 was Lloyd George, who was strongly prejudiced in favour of the Greeks. The Greeks were able to occupy an area around Smyrna in western Turkey. Smyrna had an ethnically Greek majority at the time. The Greek army was able to forge ahead and carve out more territory beyond that, deeper into the hinterland. Well, Ataturk saw that his country was at its lowest ebb, and he resolved to drive the Greeks out of his homeland. So he embarked on what the Turks now dubbed the War of National Salvation, because Turkey was really having its nose rubbed in defeat. The Turkey, which had been a fairly strong empire for centuries, was being reduced to a third-rate country, but Ataturk was having none of that. The situation seemed hopeless. The country had gone through about 8 years of near constant war, suffered many defeats, millions of its people had been killed, its industry had been wrecked, it lost control of its major cities, all the rest of it, and yet he was going to fight, and so it was just through sheer grit that he won. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Sakarya, and the Turks came out on top. The Greek army eventually evacuated from Asia Minor, that's the mainland part of Turkey. The British army was given a base at Chanak, according to the Treaty of Sèvres. It's now called Çanakkale, so it's close to the Dardanelles. So the Turkish army surrounded the British army, and there was a very tense standoff. The Turks didn't attack, but what was going to happen? They weren't backing off. They could attack at any point. The British public were absolutely sick and tired of warfare. So what were they to do? Were they going to fight or not? The Turks were breaking the Treaty of Sèvres. They'd agreed to give away all this land, and now they were fighting to push out the Greeks. The French and Italians actually never physically claimed their land. So, well, the British folded. The British government recognised there was no public appetite for war, and the public did not care about a base at Chanak that much. So a deal was struck. The British army was allowed to leave Chanak with its weapons. So they didn't surrender their weapons. And in return, the United Kingdom renounced any claim to have military bases on Turkish territory. However, the Turks did have to agree that the Dardanelles would not be fortified. That waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean, the Turks were not allowed to build any defences, gun emplacements, whatever, along there. So the Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923, as in Lausanne in Switzerland. This was much more lenient on Turkey. Turkey regained areas with a Turkish majority. The Italians and French likewise, they renounced any claim to that land. The limits on Turkey's military were lifted. Turkey was forgiven paying any reparations at all. The country Kurdistan, which is supposed to be created in southeast Turkey, never came into being. Some Kurds are in Iran, some are in Syria, and some are in Iraq. So the United Kingdom had backtracked on its promise to help the Kurds in the face of this obdurate Turkish position. Anyway, so what else? There had been a determined challenge to the Paris Peace Treaties, and it had paid off. The British were not willing to fight to uphold this new world order. The Turkish Republic then coordinated an attack with Bolshevik Russia against the newly independent Armenia. So Armenia was rapidly crushed and forcibly integrated into the Soviet Union. Incidentally, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was founded in December 1922. But USSR, but you often call it Soviet Union. So the rump of Armenia was part of the USSR, but a small section of Armenian territory became part of Turkey, including the historic Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark supposedly came to rest when the Great Flood subsided. So the Ottoman Empire was still broken up. The Turkish Republic did not regain non-Turkish majority areas, with the exception of Kurdistan, part of Kurdistan. So former Turkish territories, or Ottoman territories, I should say, became League of Nations mandates in many cases, under French or British control. Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq were British mandates. So the UK was to govern these countries and superintend them on the way to independence. Transjordan is simply called Jordan now, as in it's across the Jordan, to the east of the River Jordan. Palestine, that includes what we now call Israel. So the British found princes of the Hashemite dynasty to rule Iraq and Transjordan. The Hashemites, they controlled the two holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. I know Jerusalem's also a holy city of Islam, Al-Quds al-Arabi, Muslims would prefer me to call it. So they had very high status. However, in the case of Iraq, it was a Sunni monarch ruling a mainly Shia populace. Anyway, so Turkey regained territory. Turkey had done very well, and Boris Johnson's great-grandfather was a Turkish interior minister who'd advocated honouring the Treaty of Sèvres and had been lynched for it. So that was that. Turkey had revised the treaties, but then Turkey needed to rebuild and lick her wounds because she'd been through a decade of anarchy and horrific suffering.